The scene was one of chaos and terror, a landscape torn apart by fire and steel. Imagine the sound of rifles cracking in rapid succession, joined by the relentless hammer of machine guns, each burst echoing across the field. Smoke drifted low over the ground, carrying with it the acrid stench of gunpowder and the faint, bitter smell of burning earth. In the middle of that battlefield, men lay motionless, their uniforms darkened by blood, their cries for help faint yet unyielding. These were Marines, wounded and exposed, caught in the open where no cover existed and no mercy could be expected. For those still able to move, the moment was paralyzing, a collision of fear and duty. The distance that separated the wounded from safety was cruel in its simplicity. It was not a hill to climb or a trench to storm, but 800 yards of bare ground under the constant eyes of the enemy. Every inch of that ground was alive with danger, marked by invisible lines of fire that cut through the air with deadly precision. To cross it was to invite death, yet to remain where they were was to condemn their brothers to the same fate. The Marines knew the truth of it in their bones, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavier than their rifles or packs. They stood at the edge of decision, hearing the desperate shouts of the wounded while the enemy rained steel upon them. For a moment, time seemed to fracture. Some men instinctively pressed themselves flat against the ground, feeling the dirt shake beneath each explosion. Others glanced toward their leaders, searching for a command that might lift the impossible burden of choice. But no order could fully decide what was at stake, because this was not simply about tactics. It was about the bond between men who had lived, trained, and bled together. The cries from across the field were not abstract. They were the voices of brothers who had shared rations, stories, and fears in quieter hours before the battle began. The battlefield itself seemed to mock them with its emptiness. There was no ridge to hide behind, no smoke thick enough to mask their movement, only an unbroken expanse stretching endlessly toward the enemy. Every Marine understood what such a crossing would mean. They had all seen men fall in open ground before, their bodies twisting violently as bullets found them. To attempt the rescue was to walk knowingly into that fate. Yet to remain was unthinkable, for the sound of the wounded lingered in their ears, a reminder that every second of hesitation was another second stolen from a comrade's life. In the swirling noise of battle, the choice crystallized. These Marines had faced ambushes, bombardments, and close-quarter fights before, but this moment was different. It demanded not just courage, but the willingness to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. The open field became more than a stretch of contested ground. It became the test of their very identity as Marines. To act was to embrace the possibility of death. To stay behind was to abandon the code that defined them. In the terrible silence between gunfire and decision, their loyalty spoke louder than fear. The story of what came next would become a testament remembered long after the battle ended. It began here, in this suspended moment where the weight of war pressed down like an iron hand. The Marines stared into the distance, measuring the ground not in yards, but in the lives that hung in the balance. Their breaths were shallow, their hearts racing with the knowledge that every step forward would be against the current of fire. Yet they understood that the meaning of their service lived not in victories alone, but in the refusal to leave a brother behind. With that understanding, the impossible began. The battlefield gave no mercy, only harsh choices. For the Marines, standing at the edge of that fire-swept field, the decision was as stark as the terrain itself. To leave the wounded where they had fallen meant survival, a chance to hold their position without adding to the mounting casualties. Yet such a choice would haunt them, for those cries in the distance were not the voices of strangers. They were the familiar sounds of comrades who had marched beside them, laughed with them, and shared the weight of every battle before this one. In war, practicality often clashes with loyalty, and here the clash was sharper than ever. Every soldier knew the cost of attempting a rescue. To lift a wounded Marine was to move slower, to stumble under the burden, to become an easier target for enemy rifles waiting across the field. The men could see it clearly in their minds, the picture of bodies cut down halfway across the open ground. Fear whispered that it was madness to try, that survival demanded hard decisions. But fear was not the only voice. A louder, more powerful call came from within, urging them to protect the bonds forged in blood and hardship. That inner conflict tore at them, pulling in opposite directions with equal force. The contrast between safety and sacrifice was not abstract, it was painted vividly in front of their eyes. To one side lay the wounded, their movements slowing with each passing second, their lives slipping away under the relentless hail of bullets. To the other side stood the living, pressed low against the dirt, listening to the terrible chorus of gunfire that kept them pinned. The space between them was not just ground, it was a gulf carved by the cruelty of war. Crossing it meant gambling with fate itself, yet doing nothing meant watching their brothers fade into silence. The Marines wrestled with the truth that no option was without loss. If they stayed, guilt would weigh upon them forever, an invisible wound deeper than any bullet could make. If they went, they risked joining the fallen, leaving more men to carry the burden of loss. It was a brutal equation, one without an easy answer. The open field became a mirror that reflected back their own values, forcing them to confront what mattered most. Was it survival at any cost, or was it loyalty that gave their struggle meaning? That moment of contrast defined the gravity of their choice. The battlefield was not merely a place of tactics, it was a place where humanity collided with necessity. The enemy's fire created a wall of death, yet within the Marines burned a resolve not to abandon one another. Their hesitation, however brief, revealed the impossible balance they had to strike. The weight of life and death sat squarely on their shoulders, a burden that could not be shared by orders or rank. In this crucible of fire, their decision would reveal who they were and what they were willing to risk for one another. The story's power lies in this conflict, in the raw contrast between fear and loyalty, between logic and compassion. It was not a matter of strategy or victory, but of identity. To carry their wounded through the storm of bullets was to define themselves in the most dangerous way possible. And so, under the gaze of the enemy and the weight of their own hearts, the Marines prepared to answer the question that war had placed before them. The men who faced that impossible choice were not strangers thrown together by chance. They were Marines, shaped by a tradition older than themselves, bound by a code that spoke to loyalty and sacrifice. Before they ever stepped onto that battlefield, their lives had been forged through long months of training, where endurance was tested and brotherhood was born. They had marched together under the blazing sun, slept in mud-soaked foxholes, and endured the endless weight of uncertainty that comes with war. In those trials, bonds stronger than steel had formed, bonds that could not be measured by orders or discipline alone. When the cries of the wounded carried across the field, it was these bonds that stirred their hearts and anchored their decision. Life in the Corps had already prepared them for hardship. Each Marine had learned that survival depended not on the strength of one, but on the trust of all. Meals had been shared, laughter had been stolen in rare moments of peace, and secrets had been spoken quietly in the dark. They had seen one another at their strongest and at their weakest, in moments of courage and moments of fear. These shared experiences wove them together into something greater than individuals. So when fate laid their brothers low in the open, the choice to act was less about bravery and more about keeping a promise that had already been made in silence long ago. Their origins as fighters on that battlefield were marked by more than training. They had already endured earlier campaigns where death and danger were constant companions. They had seen comrades fall and had carried bodies back through mud and gunfire before. Each loss had left a mark, carving a deeper understanding of what it meant to be responsible for one another. War had stripped away illusions, leaving only the raw truth that survival was never solitary. In such a world, to turn away from the wounded would have been to deny the very lessons carved into their souls. What made the Marines unique in that moment was not just the discipline drilled into them, but the unspoken bond that connected them. They were more than soldiers fighting a war. They were brothers who had chosen to stand together in the face of death. The idea of leaving a wounded man behind was not only unthinkable, it was a violation of the very identity they had built through hardship and shared struggle. Every man knew that if the roles were reversed, his brothers would risk everything to carry him to safety. That knowledge gave weight to their actions, turning what seemed like an impossible rescue into an unavoidable duty. The decision to step into that open field was not born in the moment, but in all the moments that came before. It was the product of nights spent in fear yet held steady by trust, of mornings where exhaustion was overcome only by the sight of comrades standing beside them. War had taught them to measure courage not by words, but by deeds. And in that battlefield, courage meant answering the cries of the wounded, no matter the cost. Their origins were not just military, they were human, built on loyalty that no enemy fire could erase. This background shaped everything that would follow. The Marines did not act out of recklessness, nor from blind orders, but from the deepest sense of responsibility. The history of their service, the bonds forged in hardship, and the code that bound them as Marines all led to this moment. What appeared to be madness to some was, to them, the only choice that honored who they were. And so, with their hearts hardened by loss yet held together by loyalty, they prepared to step forward into the storm. The moment the Marines rose to move, the battlefield seemed to erupt with even greater fury. Bullets tore into the earth around them, kicking up dirt and fragments, as if the very ground were alive with violence. Imagine the sound of those rounds snapping through the air, each one carrying the weight of finality. The men carrying their wounded could feel the sharp pull of gravity with every step, the bodies on their shoulders heavier than any burden they had ever known. Sweat stung their eyes, their breaths came ragged and shallow, and every muscle in their legs screamed under the strain. Yet still they moved forward, their progress slow but steady, marked by the will to bring their brothers out of the fire. To the enemy, the rescuers must have seemed like silhouettes against the raw expanse of earth, figures too exposed to survive. But the Marines pressed on, bent low, their bodies nearly folding under the combined weight of fear, fatigue, and the men they carried. Each yard gained was a triumph against the odds, but also a gamble, for at any second a single shot could end the march. The cries of the wounded spurred them on, blending with the chaos of battle in a sound that neither distance nor gunfire could erase. There was no cover to dive into, no safe place to pause, only the endless demand to keep moving. The battlefield had become a crucible, a place where loyalty was burned into permanence through the fire of combat. The rescuers themselves felt time stretch and twist. Seconds felt like minutes, and the open ground seemed endless. Every step was accompanied by the sensation of being watched, of crosshairs tracking them with merciless patience. Dirt clung to their boots, mixing with blood and sweat, until the very weight of their gear became unbearable. Yet stopping was not an option. Their minds narrowed to a single task: to place one foot in front of the other, to carry the living weight of their comrades until safety was reached. The battlefield offered them no encouragement, but the bonds between them gave strength where none should have existed. For those who witnessed it, the sight was unforgettable. Fellow Marines, pinned down and powerless to help, watched with both awe and dread as their brothers carried men across that barren field. They could only pray, their hearts pounding as they tracked every step, every stumble, every near fall. Some whispered encouragement into the dirt, as if their words might somehow carry across the distance. Others clenched their fists, torn between the instinct to join the rescue and the knowledge that one more body in the open might only add to the toll. Watching the rescue unfold was a torment in itself, a helplessness, nearly as painful as the fight for survival. The impact of this act went beyond the physical crossing of 800 yards. It transformed the atmosphere of the battlefield, showing that even in the face of overwhelming danger, humanity endured. The Marines carrying the wounded were not simply fighting a war, they were defying it. Each step was a declaration that no man would be left behind, no matter how dire the circumstances. The risk was immense, but the meaning was even greater. In the middle of chaos and destruction, an act of loyalty became a beacon of strength that cut through the smoke and noise. By the time they had carried their comrades to relative safety, the men were beyond exhaustion. Their uniforms were torn and soaked, their bodies trembling with fatigue, their ears ringing from the constant roar of gunfire. Yet, what they carried was more than the weight of their brothers. They carried a message that spread quietly among the survivors, a reminder of what it meant to serve, to endure, and to sacrifice. The battlefield had not spared them, but in their struggle, it had revealed something larger than combat. It had revealed the unbreakable spirit of Marines who chose loyalty over fear. The rescue did not end when the Marines finally placed their wounded brothers behind a fragile line of safety. In many ways, its true impact only began there. Those who survived watched in silence, their eyes reflecting both relief and disbelief. What they had seen was more than an act of courage. It was a living testament to the very code that bound them together. In the midst of relentless fire and unforgiving terrain, they had witnessed loyalty carried out in its purest form. The effect was immediate, spreading through the ranks like a quiet current of strength. Men who had been weary, battered, and unsure found themselves steadied by the knowledge that no one would be abandoned. For Marines who remained pinned down in the field, the rescue shifted their outlook. It was no longer just about enduring the next barrage or surviving the next hour. It became about holding on because they knew that their brothers would do the same for them. The image of men carrying their wounded across open ground burned into their minds, searing itself as proof of what they could expect in their darkest moment. Fear still hung heavy in the air, but it was tempered by something stronger, the certainty of shared sacrifice. This was not simply a fight to live, it was a fight to live together. Beyond the immediate moment, the consequences rippled further still. Acts like this reinforced the very culture of the Marine Corps, where unity was not an idea, but a necessity. Each man understood that the mission was not just about defeating the enemy, it was about protecting each other. In the brutal mathematics of war, numbers and tactics often dictated outcomes. But loyalty, displayed so vividly in that rescue, reminded the men that morale could alter the balance in ways no weapon could. The story of that march across open fire would be carried in whispers and retellings, becoming part of the invisible armor that shielded spirits against despair. For the wounded themselves, the consequences were deeply personal. They had felt the weight of helplessness, lying exposed under merciless fire, expecting at any moment to be struck down. Yet, instead of abandonment, they had been lifted, carried on the shoulders of men who refused to let them go. That memory became as powerful as any physical healing, proof that even in the heart of destruction, they mattered. It was survival not only of body, but of faith in the bonds that defined their brotherhood. To know that others would risk everything to save them gave meaning to the pain they carried long after the battle had passed. The act also served as a warning to despair itself. War often strips men of hope, grinding them down until all that remains is the instinct to endure one more moment. But in this rescue, hope was rekindled. The message was clear. Even under impossible fire, even across 800 yards of barren death, loyalty could carry men through. That knowledge did not erase the horrors of the battlefield, but it gave them a reason to keep fighting. It reminded them that their service was measured not just in victories, but in the refusal to surrender to fear. The wider consequences of this single act reached beyond tactics and beyond that day. It became part of the living memory of the unit, something carried forward into each new fight. Men would look back on it when facing new dangers, drawing strength from the knowledge of what had been endured before. It became a reminder that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. On that battlefield, the Marines had chosen loyalty, and in doing so, they had shaped not only their survival, but the spirit of those who would follow. The crossing of the field was the breaking point, the moment when the struggle between life and death sharpened into something unforgettable. Each step dragged against the weight of exhaustion, the ground itself seeming to resist their progress. Gunfire raked the open space without pause, striking the dirt inches from their boots, sending shards of earth stinging against their faces. The Marines carrying the wounded could hear the hiss of bullets whipping past their ears, so close that the air itself seemed to tear. They staggered under the combined weight of fear, fatigue, and their brothers clinging to life, yet their bodies refused to stop. In that relentless march, the climax of their ordeal took shape. Imagine the silence in their minds, broken only by the pounding of hearts and the desperate sound of breathing, heavy and ragged. Time lost all sense of rhythm. A second stretched into eternity, while a yard of ground felt like a mile. Every stumble was a near disaster, every pause an invitation for death to strike. Yet somehow, in the middle of this chaos, a kind of focus emerged. The world narrowed to the feel of another man's arm around their shoulders, to the strain in their muscles, to the thought that the next step might be the one that carried them all beyond reach of enemy fire. The climax was not a single instant of triumph, but a long, punishing gauntlet of endurance. The Marines pressed forward even as their bodies trembled and their vision blurred. They leaned into each other for strength, their movements synchronized by necessity, their steps steady despite the chaos around them. Bullets carved the air with mechanical precision, yet none could pierce the determination that drove them. The act of carrying their wounded was no longer simply about survival. It became a defiance of fate, a declaration that even in the heart of fire, loyalty was stronger than fear. Observers from behind the lines watched the struggle unfold in a kind of breathless silence. Each man knew that at any moment the march could end in disaster, the rescuers collapsing into the dirt under a hail of gunfire. Yet the sight of them refusing to yield filled onlookers with something beyond fear. It was awe, born from the recognition that they were witnessing courage in its purest form. Men clenched their rifles tighter, whispered prayers into the dust, and silently promised themselves they would never forget what they saw that day. The climax reached its breaking point when the rescuers finally crossed the last stretch of open ground. Every inch of their bodies screamed for relief, yet they pushed forward until at last they stumbled into the fragile safety of cover. The moment was raw, filled with gasps of breath, trembling hands, and the weight of brothers finally set down gently on the earth. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory, only the heavy silence of men who had done the impossible. Their survival was not just physical, it was spiritual. They had carried more than flesh across that fire-swept ground. They had carried the very essence of loyalty itself. In that instant, the climax resolved itself into something larger than the battle around them. They had not defeated the enemy, nor had they changed the course of the war with their march. But they had claimed something that no gun could take away. The act itself became a victory, a triumph carved out of despair. It was proof that even in the face of annihilation, the human spirit could endure. The climax of their ordeal was not measured in tactics or ground gained, but in the unyielding will to bring their brothers home. When the echoes of battle finally faded, what remained was more than the memory of bullets and smoke. The story of Marines carrying their wounded across 800 yards of open fire lived on in the hearts of those who saw it. It became a moment retold in hushed tones, not as a tale of strategy or command, but as a story of brotherhood. Men who had once doubted their own strength remembered it and found courage in the recollection. The ordeal did not disappear with the battle. It became part of the living memory of the Marine Corps itself. For the men who had carried their brothers, the experience was etched into their very bones. They remembered not only the weight of the wounded on their shoulders, but also the sting of dirt against their faces, the sound of rounds snapping through the air, and the silence when they finally collapsed into safety. Those sensations stayed with them long after the war ended, rising in quiet moments of reflection. It was not glory that they remembered, but the grim determination that had driven them forward step by step. In their private recollections, the march was less about heroism and more about survival, bound to loyalty. The legacy of that act stretched beyond the individuals involved. It became part of a larger tradition, a thread woven into the fabric of Marine identity. Generations that followed would hear the story and understand that courage was not only about charging the enemy, but about refusing to leave anyone behind. It reminded them that in the worst conditions imaginable, what gave meaning to their service was not only victory, but devotion to each other. The 800-yard march across open fire became more than history. It became a standard against which loyalty was measured. Even decades later, the story continues to resonate. Veterans would speak of it when teaching younger Marines, not to glorify war, but to highlight the weight of responsibility that comes with service. Families of those who lived and those who died carried it as a reminder of what sacrifice truly meant. The legacy was not one of weapons or strategies, but of humanity preserved in the darkest hour. It stood as evidence that even when war stripped everything away, loyalty could remain unbroken. The closing of this chapter does not end in victory banners or grand declarations. Instead, it ends in quiet remembrance, in the knowledge that what was done in that fire-swept field has never been forgotten. The Marines who carried their brothers through danger left behind more than a story. They left behind a living testament to the power of sacrifice, loyalty, and unity. That legacy endures, echoing across time, reminding us that even in the heart of war, the human spirit can shine with unyielding light.